Living in a small town in Texas meant everyone knew everyone, or at least that is what I thought. My wife Caroline and I had been married for 12 years. We lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town with our 2 kids, Emma and Jake. Life was not easy, but we made do. Caroline worked at the local diner while I took odd jobs wherever I could find them, mainly in construction and maintenance. One scorching summer evening after a long day working on a construction site, I came home to find Caroline more distant than usual. She had been acting strangely for weeks, often coming home late and avoiding eye contact. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, she received a text message. She quickly glanced at her phone and then tucked it away, but not before I noticed the name Brad flash on the screen. "Who is Brad?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Just someone from work," she replied too quickly, avoiding my gaze. "Nothing important." I tried to let it go, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. Caroline was spending more time getting ready for work, wearing makeup she usually reserved for special occasions, and her shifts at the diner seemed to be getting longer. I decided not to confront her just yet. Instead, I pretended not to notice the changes, watching her closely to gather more information. I knew I needed to be sure before making any accusations. The kids deserved at least that much. One night, curiosity got the better of me. While Caroline was in the shower, I checked her phone. It was locked, but I knew her well enough to guess the password: Emma's birth date. I was right. As I scrolled through her messages, my heart pounded. There were dozens of texts from Brad, filled with flirtatious banter and plans to meet up. My hands shook as I read the messages. Brad was no ordinary man. He was the owner of the biggest ranch in town, a wealthy and influential figure. What could Caroline possibly see in him? The thought of her with another man, especially someone like Brad, made my blood boil. I could not confront her yet, not without more evidence. I needed to know for sure before I took any action, so I decided to follow her. The next time she said she was working late, I waited until she left and then drove to the diner. Her car was not there. I drove around town searching for any sign of her. Finally, I saw her car parked outside a fancy restaurant on the other side of town. Through the window, I saw Caroline and Brad sitting at a corner table, laughing and holding hands. My heart shattered at the sight. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. How could she do this to me, to our family? I needed a plan, but first, I needed more evidence. If I confronted her without it, she might deny everything and turn the tables on me. The next day, I called in a favor from an old friend, Jim, who worked as a private investigator. I explained the situation and he agreed to help me gather evidence. We set up cameras around the house and a GPS tracker on her car. I felt a pang of guilt for invading her privacy, but I had to know the truth. For the next few weeks, I watched as the cameras and tracker confirmed my worst fears. Caroline was spending more and more time with Brad, meeting him at his ranch and even at motels outside town. The footage was damning, showing them kissing and holding each other in ways that left no doubt about their relationship. The betrayal cut deep, but I knew I could not act impulsively. I needed a plan, something that would not only expose their affair, but also make them pay for the pain they had caused. I began to gather all the evidence, documenting every encounter and compiling it into a comprehensive file. The day finally came when I could not hold back any longer. Armed with undeniable proof, I decided it was time to confront Caroline and Brad. But I would not do it alone. I needed witnesses to ensure they could not deny the truth. I called Jim and a few close friends, explaining my plan and asking for their support. We met at Jim's office, reviewing the evidence one last time before heading to Brad's ranch. As we drove, my heart pounded with a mix of anger and anticipation. I had no idea how Caroline would react, but I was ready to face whatever came next. This betrayal had ignited a fire in me, and I was determined to see it through. When we arrived at the ranch, we found Caroline and Brad in the stables, laughing and unaware of our presence. With my friends by my side, I stepped forward, my voice steady but filled with resolve. "Caroline," I called out, watching as her face turned pale. "We need to talk." Caroline froze, her eyes widening in shock as she turned to see me standing there with Jim and a few of our friends. Brad, standing next to her, looked equally shocked, but quickly composed himself, a hint of understanding in his demeanor. "What's going on here?" Brad asked, his voice sounding bossy, which I didn't like. "I think you both know what's going on," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. "Caroline, we need to talk. Now." She looked nervously between Brad and me, clearly torn between defiance and fear. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her attempt at denial failing in the face of the evidence we had gathered. "Stop pretending, Caroline," Jim said, stepping forward with a folder in his hand. "We have proof of your affair with Brad. We have photos, videos, messages, everything." Caroline's face paled as Jim handed me the folder. I opened it, revealing the evidence we'd been diligently collecting over the past weeks. Photos of her and Brad together, intimate text messages, GPS logs showing her whereabouts. All of it was irrefutable proof of her infidelity. Tears welled up in Caroline's eyes as she realized the gravity of the situation. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "How long?" I asked, my voice cracking with a mixture of anger and pain. "How long has this been going on?" Caroline hesitated, looking down at the ground. "A few months," she admitted quietly. I didn't know how to tell you." A wave of disbelief washed over me. A few months, all those nights when she claimed to have worked late or been at a friend's house. All those lies, deception. It felt like a betrayal not only of our marriage, but of everything we had built together. Brad, meanwhile, stood defiantly next to her, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" He finally spoke in a dismissive tone. "I want you to stay away from my wife," I said through gritted teeth, trying to maintain my composure. "And I want Caroline to come with me right now." Caroline looked torn, her eyes flickering between Brad and me. I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're coming home with me, Caroline," I said firmly, reaching out to take her hand. "We'll talk about this at home." Brad scoffed, taking a step forward. "She doesn't belong to you," he said arrogantly. "Caroline can make her own decisions." "Not when those decisions hurt our family," I shot back, my anger flaring. "Now, are you going to let her go peacefully, or am I going to have to make this story public?" Brad hesitated, exchanging a tense look with Caroline. Finally, he nodded, his expression cold. "Fine," he said abruptly. "She's all yours." Caroline followed me silently to the car, her face pale and tear-stained. Jim and our friends watched in somber silence as we drove away from Brad's ranch, leaving behind the wreckage of our shattered lives. As we approached our home, the weight of everything that had happened began to sink in. Caroline sat next to me, her hands trembling in her lap. But she remained silent, lost in her own thoughts. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing for sure. Our lives would never be the same again. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, I turned to Caroline, my heart heavy with grief and anger. "We need to talk," I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. The silence in the house was suffocating. Carolina and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the weight of our situation pressing down on us. She was looking down, her fingers nervously twisting her napkin. "Why, Caroline?" I finally asked, my voice raw with pain. "Why did you do this?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't know, Gary," she whispered. "I felt lost. Brad made me feel special, like I mattered. But I never thought it would go this far." I shook my head, the betrayal still hurting. "We could have handled it," I said. "But now, with all this, I don't know if we can go back." Before she could answer, there was a loud knock on the door. My heart pounded as I got up to answer it, afraid of what might happen next. When I opened the door, my worst fears were confirmed. There stood Brad, surrounded by two burly men, a smile playing on his lips. "Good evening, Gary," he greeted me. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to punch him. "What do you want, Brad?" "This file," he said, taking a step forward. "The evidence. Give it to me and no one will get hurt." Behind me, I heard Caroline gasp. I turned around and saw her standing in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "Brad, please," she begged. "Leave us alone." But Brad was relentless. He pushed me into the house and his thugs followed him. "I don't think so, Caroline," he said in a menacing tone. "You see, this little affair has put me in a difficult position. I can't afford to let it get out." I stood my ground, blocking his path. "Get out of my house, Brad, now." Brad's smile widened. "Or what? You're going to call the cops? Go ahead. But by the time they get here, your precious evidence will be ashes." One of Brad's men grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully behind my back. I flinched but refused to back down. "You think you can just walk in here and take what you want?" I growled. "You won't get away with it." Brad laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Oh, Gary, you still don't get it, do you? I always get what I want." Before I could react, another of Brad's guards pushed Caroline into a chair, pulled out a lighter and held it menacingly up to the evidence folder on the desk. "Hand it over," he demanded, "or she will get hurt." My mind spun and I was overcome with despair. I couldn't let them destroy the evidence, but I also couldn't risk Caroline's safety. I had to think fast. "Okay," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. "I'll give you the file, just let her go." Brad raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my sudden agreement. "Smart choice," he said. "Now where is it?" I reached for the folder and for a moment my eyes met Caroline's. She looked scared, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. I held the file out to Brad, my hand shaking with anger and frustration. Brad snatched it from me with a triumphant glint in his eye. "See, that wasn't so hard, was it?" He turned to leave, waving his hand for his men to follow. "Let's get out of here." As they moved toward the door, I realized I couldn't let them win. I had to do something. Summoning all my courage, I rushed at Brad, grabbed the folder from his hands and pushed him into the wall. The thugs reacted instantly, attacking me with animalistic force. Pain exploded in my ribs as they kicked and punched me, but I refused to let go of the folder. Through the fog of pain, I saw Caroline grab a lamp and smash it over the head of one of the attackers, knocking him down. With renewed determination, I fought back, managing to land a few blows of my own. Brad, seeing that the situation was changing, jumped to his feet and ran for the door. "Let's go!" he shouted to his remaining thug. "This isn't over, Gary!" As they fled into the night, I fell to the floor, clutching the folder tightly. Caroline rushed to my side, tears streaming down her face. "Gary, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with worry. I nodded, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "I'll be fine," I said, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "But it's not over yet. Brad will come back, and next time we'll be ready." Caroline helped me to my feet, her expression determined. "What do we do now?" she asked. I looked down at the folder in my hands, the evidence that could destroy Brad and everything he stood for. "We're going to fight back," I said, determination burning in my chest. "We're going to take the evidence to the police and make sure Brad pays for what he did." With a new sense of purpose, we began to plan our next move. Brad had underestimated us, but he wouldn't make that mistake again. This time we were ready. This time we would destroy him. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Caroline and I worked together, setting aside our complicated emotions to focus on the task at hand. The betrayal still hurt, but now we had a common enemy in Brad. It was strange, almost surreal, teaming up with the person who had broken my heart. But we both knew that taking down Brad was the only way to protect our family. We compiled all the evidence we had gathered, the text messages, the videos, the GPS logs. It was a mountain of incriminating material, enough to bury Brad for good. Jim, my private investigator friend, was a huge help, guiding us on how to organize and present the evidence to the authorities. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table going over the final details, Caroline suddenly reached out and touched my hand. "Gary," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry for what I did. I know I can't undo the past, but I want you to know that I regret it deeply." I looked at her, seeing the pain and remorse in her eyes. The wound was still fresh, but for the first time I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to heal. "Let's focus on getting through this," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "We'll deal with everything else later." The next morning we drove to the police station. My heart pounded as we handed over the folder to Detective Martinez, a seasoned officer with a reputation for taking down powerful people. He listened carefully as we explained the situation, flipping through the evidence with a critical eye. "This is solid," Martinez finally said, nodding in approval. "We can definitely build a case against Brad with this. But you need to be careful. Men like him don't go down without a fight." "We know," I replied, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. "Just tell us what we need to do." Martinez outlined the next steps, including protective measures for our family. He promised to keep us updated as the investigation progressed. As we left the station, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. We were finally taking action. But Brad wasn't going to sit quietly. That evening, as we sat in the living room, the phone rang. It was Jim, sounding urgent. "Gary, I've got bad news," he said. "Brad's lawyer just called. They're filing a restraining order against you, claiming harassment." "Harassment?" I echoed, disbelief washing over me. "He's the one who broke into our house." "Brad's spinning the story to make it look like you're the aggressor," Jim explained. "You need to be careful. This is his way of trying to intimidate you." Anger flared up inside me. Brad was trying to turn the tables, but I wouldn't let him get away with it. "Well, fight it," I said firmly. "He can't scare us off that easily." Jim agreed to help us counter the restraining order, but the next few days were tense. We kept a low profile, wary of any move Brad might make. Caroline and I took turns watching the kids, making sure they were never alone. Then one night everything changed. I was in the garage working on a leaky pipe when I heard a commotion outside. Rushing out, I found Brad standing in our driveway, his face twisted in rage. He held a crowbar, his knuckles white from the grip. "Brad, what the hell are you doing here?" I shouted, my heart pounding. "Where's the evidence, Gary?" Brad demanded, his voice menacing. "Give it to me or I'll make you regret it." "You're not getting anything," I replied, standing my ground. "It's already with the police." Brad's eyes widened with fury. He lunged at me, swinging the crowbar. I barely dodged the blow, stumbling back. Caroline appeared at the door, screaming for him to stop, but Brad was beyond reason. We grappled, the crowbar falling to the ground. I managed to pin him against the wall, my anger giving me strength. "This ends now, Brad," I growled. "You're gonna pay for everything you've done." Suddenly, headlights swept across the driveway. Jim's car screeched to a halt and he jumped out, pulling Brad off me. "That's enough," Jim shouted, holding Brad back. "The police are on their way." Brad struggled, but he knew he was outmatched. He glared at me, his eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over, Gary," he spat. "He'll destroy you." As the police arrived and took Brad into custody, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. It had been a brutal fight, but we had come out on top. For now, at least. That night, as Caroline and I sat on the porch watching the stars, we knew the battle was far from over. Brad would use every trick in the book to try and wriggle out of this, but we were ready to face whatever came next. Together we would see this through to the end. And as I held Caroline's hand, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for us to rebuild what had been broken. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while I felt a spark of hope. The fight for justice had only just begun, but I was ready for whatever lay ahead. The next few days were a whirlwind of anxiety and anticipation. Brad had been taken into custody, but with his wealth and connections, we knew it was only a matter of time before he found a way out. Detective Martinez reassured us that our evidence was solid, but until charges were officially pressed, we remained on high alert. One evening, as we were sitting down for dinner, a knock on the door startled us. I opened it to find a courier holding a small, plain package. "Delivery for Gary Thompson," he said, handing it over. I signed for the package and brought it inside, puzzled. Caroline joined me in the kitchen, both of us staring at the unmarked box. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. "I have no idea," I replied, carefully opening the package. Inside was a single, nondescript USB drive. My heart skipped a beat. This was strange. "Let's see what is on this," I said, moving to the computer in the living room. As the USB drive loaded, a folder appeared on the screen titled, "For Your Eyes Only." Inside were several video files. I clicked on the first one, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The footage showed Brad, but it was not like the videos we had taken of his encounters with Caroline. This was something different. It was surveillance footage from his ranch, showing him in meetings with various men, some of whom I recognized as local politicians and businessmen. They were discussing illegal activities, money laundering, bribery, even human trafficking. Brad was at the center of it all, orchestrating everything. "Oh my God," Caroline whispered, her hand covering her mouth. This is huge." I nodded, my mind racing. This was far more than we had bargained for. If this information got out, it would not just take down Brad. It would expose a massive criminal network. The next video was even more shocking. It showed Brad in a heated argument with one of his associates. The man accused Brad of betraying him, and in a fit of rage, Brad pulled out a gun and shot him. The man fell to the ground, lifeless, and Brad calmly called someone to clean up the mess. We sat in stunned silence, the gravity of what we were seeing sinking in. This was not just about infidelity or betrayal anymore. This was about life and death, corruption and crime at the highest levels. "We need to get this to Martinez," I said, my voice trembling. "This changes everything." Caroline nodded, but just as I reached for the phone, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness and my heart leaped into my throat. "What the hell?" I muttered, reaching for a flashlight. "Gary," Caroline whispered urgently, "something is not right." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. We had been so focused on Brad's legal troubles that we had not considered the lengths he might go to protect himself. I grabbed the flashlight and headed to the breaker box, but as I approached, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. "Stay here," I whispered to Caroline, handing her a kitchen knife. "If anything happens, call the police." She nodded, fear etched on her face. I moved quietly to the front door, peering through the peephole. In the dim moonlight, I saw several shadowy figures moving around the yard, clearly searching for a way in. My heart pounded as I realized what was happening. Brad had sent his men to retrieve the evidence and silence us. This was no longer just a matter of legal maneuvering. Our lives were in danger. I crept back to Caroline. "We need to get out of here," I said urgently. "Brad's men are outside." Her eyes widened in terror, but she nodded resolutely. We moved quickly but quietly, gathering the kids and slipping out the back door. As we made our way through the yard, I heard the front door being kicked in, followed by heavy footsteps inside. We ran through the fields behind our house, heading towards Jim's place. He lived a few miles away and I knew he would help us. The adrenaline surged through my veins as we stumbled through the darkness, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter but never quite disappearing. When we finally reached Jim's house, he answered the door, bleary-eyed but alert. "Gary, what is going on?" he asked, taking in our disheveled appearance. "Brad's men," I panted. "They are after us. We have evidence, much bigger than we thought. We need your help." Jim's expression hardened. "Get inside," he said, ushering us in and locking the door. "I will call Martinez. Stay here and do not make a sound." We huddled in Jim's living room, the gravity of our situation hitting us fully. Brad's reach was deeper and more sinister than we had ever imagined. The evidence we had could bring down a criminal empire, but only if we survived long enough to use it. As we waited for the police to arrive, I held Caroline and the kids close, my mind racing with plans and contingencies. This was not over, not by a long shot. Brad had escalated the stakes, but I was more determined than ever to see justice done. We were in for the fight of our lives, but I knew we would face it together, come what may. The police arrived swiftly, securing Jim's house and escorting us to the station for safety. Detective Martinez met us there, his face a mix of concern and determination. "We are going to take this evidence and move quickly," he said. "Brad will not get away with this." As the night wore on, I found myself grappling with the gravity of what we had uncovered. Caroline's betrayal had set off a chain of events that exposed a criminal underworld right in our small town. My anger at her had not diminished, but it was now intertwined with a fierce resolve to protect my family and see justice served. I knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but with the support of friends and the determination to do what was right, we would face whatever came next. This was far from over, and I was ready to fight for the truth no matter the cost. The next few days felt like an eternity. We were holed up in the safe house, but there was no sense of safety. The threat from Brad loomed over us like a dark cloud. Caroline and I tried to keep things normal for Emma and Jake, but the tension was palpable. Every noise made us jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Caroline and I sat at the kitchen table going over the evidence again. Detective Martinez had assured us that we had enough to bring Brad down, but I could not shake the feeling that he had something up his sleeve. "Gary," Caroline said softly, breaking the silence, "what if he comes after us again?" I looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes. It was the same fear I felt. "We will be ready," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We have the police on our side now." But even as I said it, I knew it was not enough. Brad was powerful, and he had resources we could only dream of. As we sat there, a plan began to form in my mind. It was risky, but it might be our only chance. The next morning I called Jim. "I have an idea," I said, "but I need your help." Jim listened as I laid out my plan. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then he said, "You are crazy, Gary, but it just might work." We spent the next few days preparing. We knew Brad was desperate, and we were counting on that desperation to make him sloppy. We set up hidden cameras around the safe house and planted false information, letting it leak that we had moved the evidence to a remote location. The night we set the trap, the tension was unbearable. Caroline and the kids stayed with friends while Jim, Martinez, and I waited in the safe house. We kept the lights low and the doors unlocked, making it look like we had left in a hurry. Hours passed in silence. Then, just after midnight, we heard the sound of a car approaching. My heart pounded as I signaled to Jim and Martinez. We took our positions, ready for whatever came next. The door creaked open and we saw the silhouettes of Brad's men entering cautiously. They moved quickly, searching the house for the evidence. I held my breath, waiting for the right moment. As they approached the back room where we had staged the fake evidence, we sprang into action. Jim and Martinez tackled the first two men, while I took down the third. A fierce struggle ensued, but we had the element of surprise on our side. In the chaos, one of Brad's men managed to break free and run. I chased after him, my adrenaline pumping. He darted through the woods, but I was right behind him. Just as he reached the edge of the property, he stumbled and fell. "Do not move," I shouted, my voice echoing in the night. He froze and I quickly secured him, dragging him back to the house. We tied the men up and called the police. Martinez radioed for backup, and within minutes the area was swarming with officers. Brad's men were taken into custody, but I knew the real threat was still out there. As the sun began to rise, I sat on the porch, exhaustion washing over me. Jim joined me, handing me a cup of coffee. "We did it," he said, "but this is far from over." I nodded, knowing he was right. We had bought ourselves some time, but Brad would not stop until he had what he wanted. "We need to take the fight to him," I said, a new determination in my voice. "We cannot just sit and wait for him to come after us." Jim and I spent the next few days planning our next move. We knew Brad was not going to give up easily, and we had to strike while the iron was hot. Caroline and the kids were safe for now, but I could not shake the feeling that time was running out. We decided to go after Brad where it would hurt him the most, his reputation. Brad's power came from his wealth and influence, and if we could expose his criminal activities to the public, he would lose everything. Jim had connections in the media, and he arranged for an investigative journalist to meet with us. We provided the journalist with all the evidence we had gathered, including the footage of Brad's men breaking into the safe house. The journalist was eager to break the story, but he warned us that Brad would not go down without a fight. The next morning, the story hit the headlines. Local rancher tied to criminal activities was plastered across every newspaper and news channel. The town was buzzing with the scandal, and Brad's empire began to crumble. But Brad was not one to go down quietly. That evening, as I was sitting in the safe house, my phone rang. It was Caroline. "Gary, you need to come home," she said, her voice trembling. "Brad's here." My heart stopped. "What do you mean he's there? Where are the kids?" "They're safe," she replied. "But Brad's demanding to talk to you. He says if you do not come, he'll burn the house down." I jumped in my truck and raced home, my mind racing with thoughts of what I would do when I got there. When I arrived, I saw Brad standing on the porch, a gas can in one hand and a lighter in the other. "Gary," he said, a smug grin on his face, "I knew you would come. Now give me the evidence and this will all be over." I stepped out of the truck, my fists clenched. "You are finished, Brad. The whole town knows what you have done. You cannot threaten us anymore." Brad's grin faded, replaced by a look of pure rage. "You think you have won? This is far from over." He flicked the lighter and I saw the flame catch the edge of the porch. Just then a shot rang out and Brad dropped to the ground, clutching his leg. I turned to see Jim standing a few feet away, his gun still smoking. "Drop the lighter," Jim commanded, his voice steady. Brad, wincing in pain, let the lighter fall to the ground. The police arrived moments later, arresting Brad and putting out the small fire on the porch. As they led Brad away, he glared at me. "This is not over, Gary. I will see you in hell." As the adrenaline faded, I felt a wave of relief. Caroline ran to me, tears streaming down her face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice breaking. I pulled her close, holding her tightly. "We are safe now," I said, though I knew it was not entirely true. Brad might be behind bars, but his threat still lingered in the back of my mind. The next few days were a blur of police statements, media interviews, and trying to return to some semblance of normalcy. Caroline and I knew we had a long road ahead of us to rebuild our trust and our family, but we were determined to make it work. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Caroline took my hand. "I'm so sorry for everything," she said, her voice filled with remorse. "I never meant to hurt you or the kids." I looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "We will get through this," I said, squeezing her hand. "We have been through hell, but we are still here. That has to count for something." As we sat there, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift. We knew we had a long way to go, but we also knew that we had each other. And in that moment, that was enough. As the days went by, life in our small town started to return to a semblance of normalcy. Brad was behind bars, awaiting trial for a laundry list of charges, including breaking and entering, arson, and conspiracy. His empire was crumbling, and the town was still buzzing with the news. Caroline and I worked hard to rebuild our relationship, attending counseling sessions and trying to piece together the fragments of our lives. One evening, as we were having dinner with the kids, the phone rang. I picked it up, and to my surprise, it was Jim. "Gary," he said, his voice tense, "I need to talk to you. Can you come by my office?" I agreed and told Caroline I would be back soon. When I arrived at Jim's office, he looked more serious than I had ever seen him. "What's going on?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Gary," he said, "I have some news. It seems Brad has some powerful friends. He's managed to get bail and he's out." My blood ran cold. "What? How is that possible?" Jim shook his head. "He's got connections and he's used every one of them to get out. I do not know what his plans are, but I thought you should know." As I drove home, my mind raced with the implications of Brad being out. I knew he would not let things go. He was a vengeful man, and I had exposed him and taken everything from him. I could not shake the feeling that he would come after me and my family again. That night, I did not sleep. I stayed up, keeping watch, half expecting Brad to show up at any moment. Days passed without incident, but the tension was palpable. Caroline and I were on edge, and even the kids sensed something was wrong. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the phone rang again. This time it was a number I did not recognize. I answered, and a familiar voice sent chills down my spine. "Gary," Brad's voice was cold and calculated. "You thought you could take me down? This is not over. I am coming for you." Before I could respond, he hung up. I immediately called Jim and the police, but there was little they could do. Brad had not broken any laws by calling me, and without more concrete evidence, their hands were tied. As I hung up the phone, I knew we had to take matters into our own hands. We could not live in fear, waiting for Brad to make his move. Caroline and I discussed our options and decided we needed to confront Brad once and for all. Jim helped us come up with a plan. We would lure Brad to a remote location where we could record his threats and get the evidence we needed to put him away for good. It was risky, but we were out of options. The next day I called Brad, pretending to be desperate and willing to make a deal. I told him I had evidence that could destroy him and that I wanted to meet to discuss terms. He took the bait. That evening I drove to the designated meeting spot, a deserted warehouse on the edge of town. Jim and a few trusted friends were hidden nearby, ready to record the encounter and intervene if things went south. Brad arrived, his car's headlights cutting through the darkness. He stepped out, a smug grin on his face. "Gary," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "I knew you would come crawling back." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "I have the evidence, Brad, but we need to talk." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Show me." I pulled out a flash drive from my pocket, holding it up. "This has everything, but I want assurances that you will leave me and my family alone." Brad laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "You think you can bargain with me? I will take that evidence and then I will take everything from you." At that moment, Jim and the others emerged from the shadows, cameras rolling. Brad's expression shifted from triumph to fury. "What is this?" He spat, realizing he had been set up. "It is over, Brad," I said, my voice steady. "We have everything we need to put you away for good." Brad lunged at me, but Jim and the others restrained him. As he struggled, his face twisted with rage, he screamed, "This is not over, Gary. You will pay for this." The police arrived soon after, and this time they had enough evidence to ensure Brad would not see the light of day for a long time. As they took him away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Back at home, I hugged Carolyn and the kids tightly. We'd been through hell, but we had come out the other side stronger. It would take time to heal, but we had each other, and that was what mattered. As I stood on the porch, watching the stars come out, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. Brad was gone, and we could finally move forward. The future was uncertain, but I knew we would face it together, come what may.